Welcome into Week 9 Fantasy Football Lineup Advice, everybody. In this episode, I'll be breaking down my start and sit wide receivers for this week's action. Usually what I've done in the past is make these separate episodes, but I think if I include both portions in this one longer segment, it'll make it a little bit easier for you to not only find this content, but just stick with it and listen to the whole thing here. So let me know if you like this longer style, spread out portion of content here, or if you like that separate video style content. Nonetheless, it'll still be organized in today's episode, and you'll easily be able to hear my takes on the 10 players covered in today's video. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time and let's dive in. All right, so as we always do here, I'll be breaking down my picks from the prior week. This week, wide receivers were the death of me here. I had a very good week picking the running back position, but we went just 50% overall, combining the wide receiver starts and sits. We went 2 of 5 in the start segment last week. Only 2 guys cracked double digits. It was actually pretty disappointing. I had a couple of guys like Michael Pittman Jr. who got stuffed at the 1-yard line. Had he broke the plane, would have got in for 6 more points and elevated that to a much better looking 3 of 5. But at the end of the day, we did go 3 of 5 on the sits as well. Our 2 misses there were Romeo Doubs, who I did not think would be capable of putting out the stats he did against the Buffalo team, and then Jakobi Meyers, who had himself a monster game and scoring his 3rd touchdown in 4 weeks. So to kick off the starts here for this week, I'll be starting out with DJ Moore, giving him the go-ahead against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, PJ Walker has totally revitalized this man's fantasy season, and I'm here for it. He's been extremely frustrating this year. The last 2 weeks have been his best 2 games of this regular season, and the one common factor there has been the presence of PJ Walker starting for this team. Now, what I like about this Cincinnati Bengals matchup, despite the fact that on paper it doesn't look great, is that unfortunately they lost their top cornerback, their number 1 corner, Chidobe Awuzie, for the season to an ACL injury. So automatically it's going to be a next man up type mentality. This is also not quite the same Bengals offense. This is a team that doesn't have Jamar Chase, obviously, so they won't nearly be the same high-octane group that's going to be pushing the tempo of this game and scoring a high number of points, but they're still very capable of doing that with Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins, which, we'll talk about one of those names here in just a second. So at the end of the day, I do think there's a lot of opportunities for DJ in this matchup. He's also had 8 or more targets in 4 of the 5 last games, the one exception being a 7-target game. So the volume is starting to appear here. I think that no Christian McCaffrey for 2 weeks also has, something to do with his last 2 games being extremely impressive. There's more opportunities overall in this offense, despite the fact that their running back position is still being highly effective. So I think that at the end of the day here, this is a win-win situation. A guy who's seeing his fantasy season get back on the right track here, and the matchup looks better if you put that context of the injury to the cornerback position, more prevalent. They were extremely thin, Cincinnati was, on Monday Night Football, and ended up having Dax Hill get fried over the top by Amari Cooper late in the game, which really put things out of hand. So the Panthers are also 7.5-point dogs entering into this matchup, which, of course, being more than a touchdown underdog, you assume a late pass-happy game script for this team. Tyler Boyd here on the other side of this matchup. I think Tyler is in for a much better second going with this Bengals offense as the number 2 receiver on paper. T. Higgins, of course, is going to be the number 1. You're going to start him regardless. He's basically a set-it-and-forget-it type player here at this stage and point without Jamar Chase. However, I do think that for Tyler, having just 5 targets in his first game, again, without Jamar on the field this season, is kind of fluky. I didn't think this Bengals offense got into a rhythm or a comfortable position at any time in this matchup. I think that the hellacious pass rush of Cleveland really got after Joe Burrow, really bothered him, and it was a really bad situation to be in. So I think that Carolina, while they do have some playmakers on the defensive front, they can get after Joe a little bit here. It isn't the same. There's no Myles Garrett on this team. Brian Burns is a heck of a player, but again, he's not Myles Garrett. So I think Joe has a bit more time in this matchup. I think they make some tweaks offensively and figure out how to get guys out of the slot like Tyler Boyd, who have a bit more separation and cushion off the line of scrimmage, how to get them in the ball in their hands quickly in space very effectively. So there was too many passing attempts being thrown into the flats to swinging running backs, Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon being very involved in that facet of things. Get your receivers out in space. Get your more talented playmakers the football. He got kind of bailed out this week. I would have had him as a must-start had I known that information about Jamar being out, in the process of me making this episode. That was news that came out after posting this video. I'll be honest, I would have put him as a must-start player last week. Totally got bailed out by a late touchdown, and it was kind of a fluky play as well. Higgins, his touchdown was a Moss catch where he just stole the ball from a DB. Tyler Boyd's touchdown was actually directed towards him tipped and then kind of picked out of the air by him. So a couple of things bounced his direction. I think things get a bit better here. Terry McLaurin, his fantasy stock swinging back in the right direction this season as well. Taylor Heineke, quarterback play has a large say in how fantasy receivers do. They're a dependent position here. They need quality targets from the QB spot. And at the end of the day, Carson Wentz was just kind of spreading the love a little bit. And at the end of the day, things, I just said that twice. That's kind of annoying. I'm sorry. Things kind of come down to basically Taylor Heineke is clearly on the same page with McLaurin, more so than Curtis Samuel even, who produced in one of the games here the started of the last two. But no Jahan Dotson on the field helps as well. But basically going back to 2020 and even 2021 with Heineke as the preferred quarterback for this team, you've got yourself a player who has developed that chemistry. It's pre-existing with Terry, and you're seeing that early in his starting tenure for 2022 here. So I think his presence has been a major positive for McLaurin here, who has had 8 targets in both games played with Taylor. Again, in those 2 starts for Heineke, McLaurin has 73 or more yards this season in back-to-back 13-point games. So Minnesota, I literally say this every single week, we saw some nice Pat P plays in this past game. However, I still feel that despite the fact that their pass rush is good, the one thing that could throw this off here is kind of like the Joe Burrow thing. If Minnesota's pass rush gets after and totally eats Heineke alive, because the Washington Commanders do not have a good pass protection unit, if there's no time to throw the ball downfield to Terry, that could become problematic. He's not necessarily a line of scrimmage type player, but this back end for Minnesota is susceptible and plays can be made against them, and Terry McLaurin is one heck of a receiver. He just needs, optimal opportunities to make things happen. So Washington against Minnesota, starting Terry here in week 9. Keenan Allen against against the Falcons. He's playing for the Chargers, of course. This one is entirely fixated and dependent on health. I actually have an asterisk next to Keenan Allen that if he, for some reason, because apparently he tweaked his hamstring this week, so that is a problem. If it sounds like he is going to be limited, or again, the potential for him to not play, what I would look to do is simply play Josh Palmer. But the issue with Josh Palmer is that he also is questionable with a concussion. So it would be a shame if neither of these two can play. You're playing the last ranked Atlanta Falcons passing secondary. So there's a lot of opportunity to be had in this matchup. And again, it would suck to see neither of them be out there on the field, but that could potentially be the reality of the situation here. So I'm just tossing that out there first and foremost. But look, no Mike Williams. That is for certain. It would suck for the Chargers and Charger fans out there. You could lose this game. Falcons, they have been kind of a warrior team here that's, put up a really solid run game and played teams very close late in games with the exception of a couple here. So, and actually not even a couple. It's been one game where they really just got blown out. So if you're looking at this thing from top to bottom, this matchup is extremely juicy. Again, this is a number 1 ranked matchup for fantasy receivers to find success so far this season. And Keenan Allen can completely be a volume monster underneath, eat up a bunch of targets, and get himself some run after a catch. Josh Palmer can do the exact same thing, again, if Keenan is limited in some facet and isn't able to be 100% ready to go. So I've got both these guys as top 30 plays this week, looking to them to be some of those critical playmakers for lineups here in week 9. And then Romeo Doubs here, taking a look at the Green Bay Packers. Now, the reason I'm saying Romeo Doubs and not Allen Lazard is simply that I'm not 100% sold that Lazard's going to be able to play this week. He was in an arm sling after all just a week and a half or so ago. So for me, Doubs, whether he's the number 1 receiver or number 2, of course, if Lazard's out there, I'd bump him as the priority to start for this week, assuming he plays a full, game worth of snap count percentage. But at the end of the day, this is an incredibly good matchup in a fixed environment at Ford Field. So I do feel that you're getting a situation where weather's not going to be at play here. Doubs looked even better last week than I've seen him at any time this season, making multiple contested catches and being kind of a go-to guy for Aaron Rodgers now, where his targets off the charts. No, 7 is fine. It's not phenomenal, but this is a banged-up Green Bay receiving room. They need offensive playmakers. I think Aaron Jones is a really great game in this as well. Potentially some A.J. Dillon sprinkled in here, but as the top theoretical receiver in this receiver core right now, assuming that Christian Watson can't go and assuming that Allen Lazard's banged up, I do think there's a really nice flex level opportunity for Doubs to have a really good ceiling in this game. The floor is always going to be shaky, but the matchup is there for that ceiling value to be present in week 9. All right, now I'm going to transition into some sit wide receivers for this week, starting out with Brandin Cooks, someone that I've been a little bit over optimistic on this season. His targets have been really down here this last month and have been pretty disappointing considering the circumstances of this Houston Texans offense. Now, Surprisingly, he was not moved to the trade deadline here, which just passed yesterday afternoon. You're watching this the morning after. I'm recording this late the evening of the trade deadline expiration, I guess. So you've got a situation here with a very talented player, a veteran, a 29-year-old that's still capable of stretching the field to an extent and being what I still believe is the number one receiver in this offense. But this is a brutal matchup. Again, the opportunities haven't been nearly what I've expected them to be or hoped that they would be at this season. And this is a Philadelphia matchup that, despite being a 14-point underdog, and you're probably going to have a very negative game script late here, this is a team that, in the Eagles, that just pounced all over another fellow bad offensive attack in Pittsburgh just last week. There's a lot of opportunity for late game garbage time here, but for Brandin Cooks, he has not had 7 targets or more since week 4. This is a player that is going against 2 elite perimeter corners in James Bradbury and Darius Slay. Big play Slay there. So not loving this matchup whatsoever. This is a receiver that typically plays in the perimeter as well, not necessarily just a slot receiver for this team either. So I think that there's just a few too many things that give me unease in this matchup, and I'm looking to stay away from Cooks here. He has lost my trust, and I have him outside of my top 30 receivers for week 9. Devin Duvernay here, a name that the reason he makes today's list is not necessarily because he is a weekly starter every time out here, but because due to injury, he has seen, obviously, his next man up type mentality here for the Ravens. He has seen his role potentially expand for this upcoming week's matchup. Rashad Bateman sounds like his foot is going to continue being a problem and persist for a few more weeks. He's going to miss this week's matchup. Mark Andrews. I almost said Mark Ingram. Mark Andrews is a bit banged out for this game as well, and his availability is kind of in question here. So what does that mean for Devin Duvernay? Again, it means that he's going to have more potential opportunities in this matchup. It means that the offense should be a bit more dependent on his level of involvement in this offense in order to score points and produce yardage for this team. So this week they've got the late game Monday Night Football on ESPN. So they're basically the last slate of games. You're going to be looking at this as kind of a do or die game if you still got fantasy players in the contest. So overall, I'm just staying away from Duvernay here because of a lack of overall volume this season, despite having numerous games without Bateman on the field. This is a guy that's managed to score 9 or more fantasy points in half PPR scoring, which is actually pretty solid for a flex play 5 times this year. However, in 3 games where he's had 5 or more targets, which is all that he's had, like he literally has 5 targets or more 3 times this year, he's only managed to score 9 or more points 1 out of those 3. So volume clearly is not necessarily the sole dependent factor on Duvernay scoring production here. He just needs a big play. He needs a big touchdown. He needs a huge splash play on the game. And those are so hard to predict here. And this is a Saints defense right now coming off of a very hot win. I don't want anything to do with this. So I think this is a lower end, highly fluctuating bust potential player here for the flex position this week. Again, despite the fact that his role could be expanded for this game, I'm still looking to stay clear of him and find better options. Jakobi Meyers here. Had him as a sit last week. He burned us, went totally crazy. But this week is an opportunity where I feel like it's an even tougher situation for Jakobi to produce against here. This is a defense in the Indianapolis Colts that is second against opposing fantasy wide receivers right now. That is a handful. This is a team that in the slot has been very solid. On the perimeter, they've got very good defensive players as well. Stephon Gilmore, of course. They are a tough bunch to produce statistical yardage and production against. So I'll be staying away. This Patriots offense has been sputtering lately. Jakobi was like, between Jakobi and Ramondre Stevenson, kind of the lone star players or the lone bright spots for this team. I don't like what I'm seeing from this team offensively. I think the offensive line problems have been very prevalent, and I'm honestly surprised that Jakobi at times has been able to overcome that because of the poor quarterback play, the carousel they've had there. So props to him for getting the job done. He's got a touchdown in 3 out of 4 games here. But if I had to bet, I would say that this would be a week where they shut him out of that end zone and keep his production down a little bit. Obviously, volume is something that could get him over the edge here if he continues to haul in a high volume of passes, which actually hasn't been nearly as constant as it's been in years past. However, again, matchup is very, very tough. Rondale Moore here going against Seattle. So I went back and looked at his matchup from week 6, and I was very surprised to see that in 10 targets, Rondale Moore accumulated just 49 yards. This Seattle defense is 3rd against opposing fantasy receivers, so a very tight and stingy matchup, a situation that could go south very quickly if things obviously, aren't... Basically, if Rondale doesn't make a splash play in this game or score a touchdown, you're going to be looking at limited production. This is a fast and hungry Seattle defense. They're looking to get after it, of course. And for Rondale Moore, he's basically limited in what he can do per se. They're not going to line him up in the perimeter. He's going to see volume out of the slot, but if he can't get right after catch, if he can't, pop a big play here, he is going to struggle. And maybe he finds something on tape, finds a loophole in this defense, and makes something big happen here. But after seeing that, after seeing DeAndre Hopkins' dominance, Rondale and him coexisted this past week, but it was against a weaker Vikings secondary. I just think the writing on the wall is here in terms of him having a bit of a quieter game in this matchup, because again, when he did have that elevated role against Seattle with Hollywood Brown as the one in week 6 and him being the clear-cut number 2 wide receiver pre-Hopkins return, he was able to soak up those targets. He was able to have that involvement, but the production did not result. So it was basically 4.9 yards per target, which is very, very poor. So I'm staying away from this one in this week's matchup. Something that I guess I haven't really talked through in this week's episode is that for the sit receivers, I think it's kind of hard to find some, really legitimate options for this category. I think that Rondale in full PPR leagues, your 10 and 12 man leagues is definitely a sit in those deeper formats. But obviously, for shallower leagues this week, it's tough to find guys you don't want to start, because when I was looking at the matchup situations, this is totally off topic here. I actually wanted to bring this up at the beginning of today's episode, but I forgot to. The tougher matchups are all kind of had by the stud receivers this week. So the 4th-ranked Chicago fantasy defense against wide receivers has Tyreek Hill in this week's matchup. Jalen Waddle, of course, as well. The 6th-ranked Texans defense against fantasy receivers has Philadelphia and A.J. Brown. Obviously, that's largely attributed to Derek Stingley and what he's done in that back end. Who else do we got? Stephon Diggs has the top 10-ranked Jets defensive secondary, of course, led by Sauce Gardner. Those stud players are the ones that have the tougher matchups, and there's nothing that I could say or do, or for that matter, even want to say or do to convince you not to start those guys, because you just set it and forget it type thing. So I found that kind of the middling bunch, your 10 to roughly 30 or so range receivers have pretty solid matchups, and with the exception of guys like Michael Pittman, who might have some question marks about his quarterback still, but again, I mentioned this earlier, was a yard away from scoring a touchdown and having a 13-plus point game. It's so, iffy in terms of the matchup situations for this week. So I think there's a lot of really solid middle-tier wide receivers this week. Again, maybe the studs underproduce a little bit by their standards just because of those difficult matchups. But at the end of the day, it's you're looking to kind of the 30 to 35 range here in terms of overall weekly rankings for guys that we're truly staying away from. In this week's matchup, the one guy that really falls within my top 20 rankings that I do have as a sit if possible, because again, there are so many other stable options in that 15 to 24 range, is Gabe Davis. Now, the reason that he is in that top 20 still is because the upside is extremely solid. So if you guys stuck with me to this point in the video to find this sit candidate for the week, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. But basically, my concern here is the fact that this Jets defense as a whole, they get after it. They've got a pass rush. They've got a defensive secondary. And although this is a Josh Allen team, we know what Gabe Davis is. And this is a tougher matchup, as Green Bay was on paper last week. And these are the ones where you can expect the bust performances to come out and show their ugly face for Davis and this Bills offense. Or not necessarily the Bills offense, but Gabe Davis as a member of this Bills offense. His first 7-target game of the season, that's pretty incredible, came last week against the Packers. And he managed to equate that to just 2 catches for 35 yards. So basically, tougher defenses. They're going to get the job done against Davis. I think that volume will always be a question mark here. This is not a player to expect to, he might have 1 or 2 double-digit target games in the entirety of this year. That's just the way this offense is trending right now. They have not had the need to do that yet with him this season. And in opportunities where they may have wanted to do that, hence the Miami game they lost earlier this year, he was banged up and wasn't 100% ready to go. So there's a lot of things to break down and digest here with Gabe Davis' situation, but the main takeaway here is a top 10 Jets defense against opposing fantasy receivers, lacking volume in a situation where this team is a 12.5 point favorite. And I said this once this year with the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was my mistake where Gabe Davis went ballistic. That secondary was not good. This Jets secondary is. If Gabe cannot be a part of that early rally to get this team a sizable lead against the Jets, he won't have the opportunity to do it late. So volume is always an issue. Late volume in this contest will be key, because I just don't expect it to be there, because I think they will control this game handedly. And if he overall can't make a big play, can't find the end zone, which are things he does very well, I'm just betting against it to happen this week because I do think it is a lot riskier, as I said, than some of those other more stable options in the 15 to 24 range of rankings, which will be posted tomorrow. And of course, you can check that stuff out and ask me all of your lineup questions in the comment section below of today or a future video this week. So thank you guys so much for watching. Those were our start sit wide receivers for week 9. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.